The warehouse smelled like rust and fear. Bianca pressed her back against the cold metal shelf, knees pulled tight to her chest, heart slamming so hard she was certain they could hear it through the walls. The footsteps had stopped. That was worse. When men like these went quiet, it meant they were no longer searching. It meant they had found. She didn't cry. Bianca never cried. Her mother Amina had raised her too stubborn for that. But her hands? Her hands were completely useless, trembling so badly that her phone slipped twice before she caught it. The overhead light above her flickered once, then died. Complete darkness. A shadow passed beneath the gap of the storage door. They knew exactly which aisle she was in. Fingers shaking, she unlocked her phone, and in her panic, she opened the wrong contact. Not her supervisor. Not campus security. Her mother's old phone book. Right at the top, saved under a single gold star emoji, was a number Amina had never once explained. Bianca stared at it for half a second. The door handle rattled. She pressed send. Please help me. I don't know who you are, but they are going to break this door down. Please. She squeezed her eyes shut and waited to be ignored. 43 floors above the city, in a penthouse office where the only sounds were ice settling in a glass and the low hum of a city that owed him, Minsu Tom's personal phone lit up. He never checked that number. Nobody had that number. He picked it up slowly, the tattooed fingers that had broken lesser men now scrolling through a message from an unknown girl who sounded like she had 30 seconds left. His second-in-command watched him read it. Watched his jaw tighten. Watched something shift in his eyes that hadn't moved in years. Sir. Minsu was already standing. Find her. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The message sat on his screen for 4 seconds. Minsu Tom was not a man who hesitated. In the world he occupied, the world of unmarked accounts, of whispered names in federal corridors, of men who disappeared without obituaries, hesitation was the first step toward a grave. He had trained that instinct out of himself at 19 years old in a basement in Koreatown, and he had never once looked back. But this message made him stop. He read it again. Please help me. I don't know who you are, but they are going to break this door down. Please. The number was unknown. The area code was local, somewhere in the industrial district, near the university freight corridors on the east side of the city. That much he could tell. What he could not tell was how anyone had reached this phone. This specific device. This number that existed in exactly 3 places: his own memory, a burned file in a safe he hadn't opened in 22 years, and... He stopped that thought before it finished forming. Ryan. His voice was perfectly level. That was the thing about Minsu Tom that made grown men loosen their collars. He never raised it. Pull the cell tower triangulation on this number. Now. And get Woo Jin on the line. His second-in-command, a lean man in his 30s named Ryan, crossed the room in 4 steps and had the number traced inside of 90 seconds. That was what Ryan was for. That was why Ryan was still breathing when 3 of Minsu's previous seconds-in-command were not. Eastfield Logistics Center, Ryan said. Storage Corridor B. She's stationary. Sir, there are 2 other phones pinging within 30 feet of her. Moving. Closing in. Minsu had already picked up his second phone. Woo Jin. Eastfield Logistics, Corridor B, Extract 1. Non-negotiable timeline. He paused. Nobody touches her. He ended the call and looked back at the message on his screen. He did not ask himself why he was doing this. He did not examine the instinct that had moved his hands before his mind had fully caught up. In his experience, the things that mattered most in life never came with clean explanations. They came at midnight through wrong numbers, through cracked doors, through the kind of desperate courage that only showed up in people who had already lost everything and were still, somehow, fighting. He typed back with one hand, the city blazing 43 floors below him like it was performing for him. Stay exactly where you are. Do not open the door for any reason. Help is 4 minutes away. I need you to keep responding to me so I know you're conscious. What is your name? He watched the 3 dots appear. They disappeared. They appeared again. Bianca. My name is Bianca. Please hurry. They're saying they'll call the police and say I broke in. I work here. I have my badge. Please. Bianca. He typed her name deliberately, like an anchor. I believe you. 4 minutes. Count with me. She counted. She didn't know why she trusted him, a stranger behind a gold star emoji in her dead mother's phone, but when the options were trust and terror, she chose trust. She counted the seconds he gave her. She watched the door handle rattle twice more and then, suddenly, go still. She heard voices outside. Different voices. Controlled, clipped, and carrying a tone that made the other men, the ones who had been hunting her, go very, very quiet. Then silence. Then a knock. 3 measured taps. Bianca. It's clear. You can open the door. She pressed her eye to the gap at the bottom. Work boots. Dark pants pressed to a sharp crease. Not the steel-toed boots the warehouse men wore. She stood up on legs that barely cooperated, unlatched the door, and opened it 2 inches. The man on the other side was built like a door himself, wide, still, and utterly unbothered. He held up a phone so she could see the screen. On it was an open text thread and the last message read, "Show her this so she knows I sent you." MT. Bianca opened the door the rest of the way. She didn't ask questions. She followed him through the corridor, past 2 other men who stood at either end like they'd been carved out of the dark, past the loading dock where the men who'd been hunting her were now sitting on the ground with their wrists zip-tied and their phones face down on the concrete. One of them tried to make eye contact with her. She looked away. They put her in a black car that smelled like leather and cedar, and the man named Wu Jin handed her a bottle of water and said nothing else, which was exactly what she needed. Her phone buzzed. Are you in the car? Her thumbs were still shaking but less now. Yes. Good. The driver will take you to a hotel tonight. Safe location, paid for, no questions. Your name won't be logged. She stared at that for a long moment. Why are you doing this? The response took longer this time. Long enough that she thought maybe he wouldn't answer. Because you asked. Go to sleep, Bianca. You're safe. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead she pulled her logistics jacket tighter around herself and watched the city scroll past the window and tried to remember the last time anyone had said those 2 words to her and meant them. She couldn't remember. Her mother used to say them. Amina, with her warm hands and her red lentil soup and her laugh that filled every room she walked into. Amina, who had been gone for 22 years in the way that the dead were gone, completely, without warning, without the chance to say anything that mattered. Bianca was 21 years old. She had never once in her life felt safe without performing the feeling for someone else's comfort. Tonight, for the first time, she thought she might actually be. Her phone buzzed again. Are you still awake? She smiled at the screen in the dark of the car. Yes. Tell me something that isn't about tonight. She thought about it. My mother made the best red lentil soup in the world. I've been trying to recreate it for 3 years and I can't get it right. A pause. Then, what's missing? I don't know. That's the problem. Another pause. Longer. Get some rest. We'll figure it out. She didn't know why those 4 words, "we'll figure it out," from a stranger whose face she'd never seen, landed somewhere deep in her chest and refused to leave. She only knew that when she finally closed her eyes in the back of that car, the shaking in her hands had completely stopped. She slept the whole way there. Minsu sat in his office long after Ryan had gone home, long after the city below him had dropped to its quietest frequency, and he stared at the text thread on his phone. He had been running operations in this city for 11 years. He had negotiated with senators and silenced prosecutors and dismantled 3 rival organizations without a single arrest touching his name. He had never once stayed up past 2 a.m. to make sure a stranger fell asleep safely. He set the phone face down on the desk. He picked it up again 30 seconds later. The last message she'd sent before going silent was a single line, "Thank you for staying on." He read it 4 times. Then he finally went to bed. It started with the soup. 3 days after the warehouse, Bianca was back in her campus dormitory. The hotel had been a single night, clean and anonymous, and when she'd woken up she'd found a prepaid phone on the nightstand with one contact saved in it under a gold star, and she was standing in the shared kitchen at 7 p.m. attempting, for the 36th time in 3 years, to recreate Amina's red lentil soup. She sent a photo of the pot to the star contact without really thinking about it. The reply came in under a minute. "You're not blooming the spices first." She looked at the pot. Then at the phone. "How do you know?" "The color. If you bloom the cumin and coriander in the oil before the onions, the broth turns that deep amber. Right now yours looks pale." She stared at the screen. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows soup." "Try it." She tried it. It wasn't exact, it wasn't Amina's, nothing would ever be Amina's, but it was closer than it had ever been. Close enough that Bianca had to set the spoon down and take a breath before she could finish cooking. Close enough that it hurt in the way that only good things hurt, the way that missing someone and feeling them at the same time hurt. She sent back, "It worked." And he sent back, "Good." That was how it became daily. Not long conversations. He was clearly a man of enormous responsibilities and very few unnecessary words. But consistent. A message in the morning, usually when she was walking to her 8 a.m. supply chain management lecture. A message in the evening, usually after she'd finished her shift at the campus logistics center, the day job that paid for books and groceries and the occasional dignity of buying her own coffee. He never asked what she looked like or where she was from or any of the things that strangers usually wanted to establish coordinates on. He asked about her day. About what she was reading. About the soup. And slowly, in the way that trust was built between people who had both learned the hard way that trust was a limited resource, she started telling him things. She told him about Amina. How her mother had come to America from Lagos at 23 with a nursing degree, 2 suitcases, and an absolute refusal to be diminished by anything this country tried to use against her. How she had died when Bianca was barely a year old, cause of death listed as cardiac event, which was the kind of clinical language that covered a multitude of questions that Bianca had been asking her whole life without anyone willing to answer them. How she had been raised by her Aunt Falake, Amina's older sister, who had loved her in the practical way of a woman holding too many things, steadily, but always slightly at arm's length. She told him about the scholarship that had brought her to Hargrove University. A merit scholarship, full ride, that had felt like Amina reaching through time to hand her something. She told him about how she'd spent her first semester barely speaking to anyone, how she'd learned to become invisible in a way that was almost a skill, how she'd thought that if she just kept her head down and worked hard and stayed out of everyone's way, the world would leave her alone. He listened. He responded. He never once offered advice she hadn't asked for, which was a rarer quality in a person than most people realized. One night she asked him, "Do you have family?" A long pause. Longer than usual. "It's complicated." "Most real answers are," she wrote back. Another pause. Then, "I had someone I loved once. A long time ago. I let the distance get too big. Do you regret it?" "Every day." She didn't push. She understood the geography of grief, how some parts of it you could walk through and some parts you had to stand at the edge of and just acknowledge were there. She sent him a photo of the soup instead. The good batch. The amber one. He sent back a single word, "Perfect." She fell asleep that night feeling less alone than she had in years. Not happy, exactly. Not fixed. But less like she was carrying the whole weight of herself in silence. She didn't know that 43 floors above the city, the man on the other end of that thread had pulled out a file he hadn't touched in over 2 decades. A manila folder, edges soft with age, containing 3 photographs and a handwritten letter on paper so old it had gone the color of tea. He spread them on his desk under the lamp. He stared at them for a long time. The file had a name on the tab. Amina Osei. Chicago, Illinois. 2002. Minsu had not opened it in 22 years. He had put it away the same week he'd put away everything that had mattered before the empire, the softness, the questions, the parts of himself that had still believed the world operated on something other than leverage and silence. He had filed it under unresolvable and moved on, because in his world, unresolvable things had to stay filed or they became weapons that other people could use against you. But the girl's name was Bianca. And her mother was Amina. And the soup she'd been trying to recreate for 3 years was red lentil with bloomed cumin and coriander, which was a recipe that had lived in exactly one kitchen in the country 22 years ago, a small apartment in the north side of Chicago where a woman named Amina Osei had made it every Sunday morning and left a bowl on the counter for him before he arrived, because she'd memorized his schedule before he'd even noticed she'd memorized his schedule. He spread the photographs on the desk. The first was Amina, young, laughing, caught mid-turn toward someone off-frame, her natural hair pulled up and a bright orange apron tied around her waist. He hadn't let himself look at this photograph in so long that the sight of it knocked something loose in his chest, something he'd spent 11 years mortaring over. The second was a letter. Her handwriting. 3 pages, written fast. The pen had pressed hard in places, lighter in others, the way handwriting looked when someone was writing between crying. He had memorized it in 2003 and he did not need to read it again. He knew what it said. It told him she was leaving. It told him she was afraid. It told him that there were people around him who had started watching her, and that she was not going to let his world touch the thing she was carrying. The thing she was carrying. The third photograph was newer, or rather, it wasn't a photograph at all. It was a printed page from a university directory. Hargrove University, class of 2025. A student profile photo. A girl with thick natural hair and wide, expressive eyes and a mouth that was Amina's mouth, exactly, down to the way it pressed together when she was thinking something she hadn't decided to say yet. Ryan had pulled it from the student records 3 days ago when Minsu had given him the name, framed it as routine background on someone who'd been present at the Eastfield incident. Routine. Nothing about this was routine. Minsu sat back in his chair and let the full weight of what he was looking at settle over him. He was not a man who fell apart. He had not fallen apart at 19 in that basement, had not fallen apart when his own father had sold information about him to a rival organization, had not fallen apart at any of the 17 moments in his adult life that had been specifically designed to break him. But his hands were not entirely steady when he picked up the third photograph. Bianca was 21 years old. Amina had left in the spring of 2003. He did the math that he'd been refusing to do for 4 days, and when it came out the same way it had come out every other time, he set the photograph down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the wood and stared at the city outside his window for a very long time. She had not told Bianca. He understood why. He understood it completely, in the way that only someone who had seen his world from the inside could understand it. Amina had been the smartest woman he'd ever known. She had looked at what he was building and she had understood, years before it became the empire it became, that the safest thing she could give a child of his was his absence. She had protected Bianca the only way available to her, by disappearing. And then she had died. And she had left her daughter a phone with one contact in it saved under a gold star. A contact that Bianca had reached on the worst night of her life. Minsu closed the file. He sat with the silence for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and pulled up everything he could find on a man named Hanjunio, because in the 3 days since Ryan had flagged the name from the conversation with the men at Eastfield, Minsu had been building a picture, and the picture was becoming very clear. Hanjunio was a mid-level political operative with significant sway over the university board and a documented habit of using institutional power like a scalpel on anyone who got close to things he wanted kept quiet. Amina had worked at a hospital connected to Hargrove before she died. The timeline was beginning to look less like coincidence and more like architecture. Minsu folded his hands on the desk. He was a patient man. He had learned patience the same place he'd learned everything else, In rooms where losing your composure was the same as losing your life. He could wait. He could build. He could dismantle a man so thoroughly that by the end, the man himself couldn't remember what he'd been before. But first, he needed to make sure Bianca was safe. He picked up the phone with the gold star thread and typed, "How is the soup today?" Her response came in 4 minutes, which meant she was between classes. "No soup today. I have a presentation. Wish me luck." "You don't need luck. You're Amina's daughter." He sent it before he'd fully processed that he was sending it. His thumb had moved on its own, and by the time he looked at the words on the screen they had already delivered. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "How do you know my mother's name?" He stared at the screen. He had 2 choices, the truth, which she wasn't ready for, or the bridge, which would keep her moving forward until she was. He chose the bridge. "She told me about you once. A long time ago. Go give your presentation, Bianca. I'll explain everything. Just not yet." A long pause. Longer than any she'd given him before. Then, "Okay. But you will explain." "I will. I promise." He set the phone down. Outside, the city hummed its indifferent, enormous hum. Inside, Minsu Tom, who had not made a promise he intended to keep in longer than he could comfortably remember, sat with the unfamiliar weight of one and found that it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. The suspension letter arrived on a Tuesday. Bianca found it slipped under her dormitory door at 6:47 a.m., which was early enough that most of the floor was still asleep and there was no one to witness the way her knees went soft when she read it. She sat on the edge of her bed and read it twice, then a 3rd time, because the first 2 times her brain refused to process it as real. Hargrove University Office of Student Conduct. Notice of interim suspension. Student, Bianca Osei. Effective, immediately. Grounds, academic misconduct, falsification of scholarship documentation, fraudulent representation of financial need. She read the grounds section 4 times. Falsification. Fraudulent. Those were not words that had ever been in the same sentence as her name. She had filled out every form for the merit scholarship herself, alone, at a library computer, because Aunt Lake's home internet was unreliable and she hadn't wanted to risk losing the session. She had uploaded every document they had asked for. She had been awarded the scholarship by a committee she'd never met and had spent 3 years working hard enough to deserve it retroactively every single day. There was a second page. A list of evidence. She looked at it and her stomach went cold, because the documents listed, bank statements, application forms, financial disclosures, were real documents. She recognized the file names. She had submitted them herself. But the figures listed in the suspension letter did not match the figures she had submitted, and she knew with the absolute certainty of someone who had checked and rechecked her own paperwork approximately 40 times that she had not submitted what this letter was claiming she had submitted. Someone had changed them. Someone had gone into the system, pulled her original application documents, altered the numbers, and re-uploaded them under her student ID. And then someone had filed a formal conduct complaint. Filed, not reported, filed, which meant it came with an institutional signature, and triggered an automatic suspension pending investigation. She sat very still for a moment. Then she thought about the warehouse. About the men with zip-tied wrists on the concrete floor. About the way the door handle had rattled and gone still and then rattled again. Han Junio. She didn't know how she knew. She only knew that the same way the body understood danger before the mind caught up, the cold in the stomach, the tunnel vision, the sudden clarity of a person who realizes they are being hunted, her body understood that this was the same hand. The same origin point. The same deliberate, institutional cruelty dressed in paperwork and official letterhead. She picked up the phone with the gold star. She typed and deleted 3 different messages before she settled on the truth. I just got suspended. They're saying I falsified my scholarship documents. I didn't. Someone changed them. I don't know what to do. She watched the 3 dots appear immediately. I know, he wrote back. She stared at that. You know, I've been watching Junio for 2 weeks. I was hoping to move before he moved. I'm sorry, Bianca. I miscalculated the timeline. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't fear, or not only fear. There was something underneath the fear that was beginning to heat up, a low, steady burn that she didn't have a name for yet but recognized as the thing her mother had apparently also carried, an absolute, bedrock refusal to be made small by people who relied on her silence. Who is he? How long has he been doing this? Long enough. Too long. Can you stop it? A pause. And then, with a certainty that came through the screen like something physical, I'm going to do better than stop it. She looked at the suspension letter again. At the words falsification and fraudulent sitting next to her name like they belonged there. She thought about Amina, who had crossed an ocean and built a life from nothing and still somehow not been able to outrun whatever this was. She thought about 3 years of 6 a.m. wake-ups and back-to-back shifts and keeping her head down, of making herself invisible so nothing could catch her. Invisible hadn't worked. What do I do right now? She typed. His response came in 30 seconds. Hold your head high. Go to your classes. Act as if the letter means nothing to you, because very soon it will mean nothing to anyone. Trust me. I barely know you. I know. Trust me anyway. She read that twice. Then she got up, smoothed her jacket, tucked the suspension letter into her folder where she wouldn't have to see it, and walked out of her dormitory room with her chin up and her jaw set in the exact expression that Aunt Folake had once described as your mother's face when she had already decided she was going to win. Down the hall, a girl named Priya, her closest thing to a friend on the floor, looked up from her cereal and said, "You okay? You look intense." "I'm fine," Bianca said, which was not entirely true. But it was going to be. 43 floors above the city, Minsu Tom closed his laptop, stood up, straightened his burgundy jacket, and turned to Ryang with the particular expression that 11 years of working for him had taught Ryang to recognize as the moment a problem went from existing to ending. "Pull everything," Minsu said. "Every account, every filing, every institutional connection Junio has to Hargrove University. Every favor he's called in, every board member he owns, every document that passed through his hands in the last 22 years. He picked up his watch from the desk and fastened it with the calm efficiency of a man getting dressed for something important. "I want it all on my desk by morning." Ryan was already moving. "And the girl?" Minsu looked at the gold star thread on his phone one more time. At "Trust Me Anyway" sitting unanswered on the screen, and then at the 3 dots that had appeared, and then, finally, her reply. "Okay." One word. The most trust he had been given in longer than he deserved. "The girl," he said quietly, "is exactly where she needs to be." He walked toward the door. "Ryang. One more thing." "Sir." "Find out exactly how Amina Osei died in 2003. Hospital records, coroner's report, every attending physician. All of it." His voice was level. Completely, utterly level. "And find out who filed the original complaint that got her dismissed from Hargrove Medical the month before she died." Ryan went very still. "Sir, do you think?" "I think," Minsu said, "that Han Junio has been doing this for a very long time." He opened the office door. The city blazed below. "And I think it's time someone did it back." 3 days after the suspension letter, the university froze her meal credits. Bianca found out at the dining hall entrance when the scanner beeped red and the student worker behind the desk gave her the particular look that people gave other people when they were embarrassed on their behalf. She stepped out of line, walked to the far end of the courtyard, sat on a bench in the cold November air, and stared at the dead fountain in front of her. She had $73 in her checking account. Her shift at the campus logistics center had been suspended along with her student status. Her faculty advisor, a mild man named Professor Gaines who had always seemed genuinely invested in her future, had stopped returning her emails 48 hours ago. The university's student conduct office had sent a follow-up letter informing her that her dormitory access would be revoked at the end of the week pending the outcome of the formal investigation, an investigation that, the letter noted, could take up to 60 days. 60 days. She did the math in the way that people with no safety net always did math, fast, cold, and without mercy. $73. No meal access. No income. No housing in 6 days. The one person who had offered to explain everything had not yet explained anything, and she was sitting on a bench in 40-degree weather with a logistics jacket that was not warm enough for November and a suspension letter that had her mother's last name sitting next to the word fraudulent like it had always belonged there. She picked up the phone. "I've lost everything," she typed. "My meals. My job. My housing at the end of the week. I have $73 and I don't know what I'm supposed to be holding my head high for anymore." She sent it before she could soften it. She was done softening things for the comfort of people who weren't in the cold. His reply came in under 2 minutes. "You haven't lost everything. You've lost what they could reach. Those are not the same thing." She typed back immediately. "That feels like a very easy thing to say from wherever you are." A pause. Then, "You're right. It does. I'm sorry." She hadn't expected that. The apology sat on the screen so plainly that she read it twice just to confirm it was there. "Bianca, listen to me. By the end of this week, the investigation will be over. Not in 60 days. This week. Your scholarship will not only be reinstated, it will be made permanent. Your meal access, your housing, your position at the logistics center. All of it." She stared at the screen. "You can't promise that." "I already have everything I need. I'm waiting for the right moment to use it." What does that mean? It means that men like Hanjunio build their power on the assumption that the people they hurt have nowhere to turn. They count on silence. They count on exhaustion. They count on you doing exactly what you're doing right now, sitting somewhere cold, doing math that doesn't add up, wondering if the fight is worth it. A pause, and then, "It is worth it. You are worth it." And he is about to find out what happens when the person he chose to hurt had somewhere to turn after all. She read it 3 times. The courtyard was empty around her. A leaf skated across the concrete in the wind. "Why do you care this much about what happens to me?" she typed. "We've never even met." The longest pause yet. Long enough that she looked up from the screen and watched 2 pigeons argue over a piece of bread near the fountain. Long enough that she started to think he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because your mother mattered to me. And because you matter. And because the explanation I owe you is coming, but not over text. Not for something this big. Hold on a little longer, Bianca. Just a little longer." She sat with that for a long moment. The cold had worked its way through her jacket and she couldn't feel her left hand very well, and she had $73 and 6 days of housing and a world that had been methodically taken apart around her by a man she had never personally wronged. She typed, "Okay." Just that. The same word she had given him before. He sent back, "I'll have groceries delivered to your dorm within the hour. And Bianca, go somewhere warm." She almost smiled. She stood up from the bench, tucked the phone into her pocket, and walked back toward the dormitory with her chin at exactly the angle Aunt Flake had once called her mother's face. She didn't know what was coming. But she believed, with the stubborn, bedrock certainty that was apparently genetic, that it was coming. It began at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday. Later, the people who witnessed the edges of it, the board members who got phone calls, the attorneys who were handed files, the university administrators who found their emails suddenly, inexplicably, forensically exposed, would describe the experience as something between an audit and an earthquake. Quiet at the start. The kind of quiet that preceded something structural giving way. Minsu's people were not loud. That was the thing about the way he operated that even his enemies, in their more honest moments, had to respect. There were no threats. No dramatic confrontations. No burning of offices or breaking of bones. There was only information, assembled with the precision of people who had spent years learning that the most devastating thing you could hand a corrupt man was a mirror. By 6 a.m., Ryang's team had compiled 14 years of Han Junio's financial architecture. Shell companies threaded through 3 states. A private foundation that had been receiving university grant money and redistributing exactly 60% of it into accounts connected to board members who had, over the same 14 years, voted in lockstep on every policy Junio had ever needed passed. A paper trail so clean on the surface and so rotten underneath that it had the quality of a beautiful building with no foundation, the kind that looked permanent right up until the moment it didn't. By 7 a.m., 3 of those board members had received calls. Not threatening calls. Informational calls. Quiet, professional, factual calls from attorneys representing anonymous clients, conveying that certain documentation had come to light and would be finding its way to the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General unless certain administrative decisions were revisited before the end of the business day. By 8 a.m., 2 of the 3 had made their own calls. By 9 a.m., Minsu's people handed a separate package to a journalist at the city's largest independent paper, a woman named Coretta Webb who had been investigating university financial impropriety for 2 years and had been stonewalled at every turn. The package contained everything. Every account, every vote, every redirect. Coretta Webb read the first 12 pages and called her editor before she finished the 13th. But that was the public layer. The private layer was older and worse, and Minsu had saved it. Ryang had found the hospital records. It had taken 4 days and 2 contacts inside the medical record system of Northwestern Memorial, but he had found them, Amina Osei's full file from 2003, including the attending notes and the coroner's summary. Cardiac event, the death certificate said. And technically that was true, in the way that a building collapsing on a person and the person dying from the impact was technically a structural failure. What the attending notes showed, buried in the clinical language of a woman who had written it carefully and then apparently never followed up, was that Amina had presented with symptoms consistent with a medication interaction. A medication that had been prescribed to her by a physician connected to the Hargrove Medical Network. A physician whose license had been quietly suspended 2 years later for an unrelated prescribing irregularity and who had died in 2011. A physician whose patient referrals, in 2003, had been directed almost exclusively through the office of a hospital administrator named, and here the architecture became visible, became the thing Minsu had been half building and half dreading since he opened the file, a hospital administrator who had been, at the time, a junior associate of Han Junio's political operation. Amina had filed a whistleblower complaint against the Hargrove Medical Network 6 weeks before she died. A complaint about financial irregularities in patient billing. A complaint that had been dismissed. A complaint that, according to the records Ryang had pulled, had been personally reviewed and closed by a senior administrator connected to Junio. 6 weeks later, she was dead. And her daughter had grown up without her. Minsu sat with this information for 1 hour. Alone, in his office, with the file open in front of him and the city doing its indifferent mourning outside the window. He allowed himself the hour because he was a man who understood the danger of acting from grief, and what he felt sitting with those records was grief, old, enormous, the kind that had been waiting 22 years for the moment it could finally take its full shape. He allowed himself the hour. Then he picked up the phone and called his attorney. By 11 a.m., a formal criminal referral had been filed with the State Attorney General's office, accompanied by a package of evidence thick enough that the intake paralegal had called her supervisor over to look at it. By noon, Han Junio's lead financial witness, a man named Terence Polk who had been providing cover for Junio's foundation accounting for 9 years, had been handed a separate set of documents demonstrating, very clearly, the specific exposure he personally faced if the matter proceeded to federal court. Terence Polk had a family. Terence Polk had, it turned out, been looking for a reason to cooperate for 3 years and had simply never been given one. He was given one at 12:07 p.m. on a Wednesday. He called the Attorney General's office at 12:14. By 2 p.m., Han Junio's access to the Hargrove University Administrative Network had been suspended pending an emergency board vote. The vote, which should have taken days to schedule, was called for 4 p.m. by the 3 board members who had received the morning's phone calls, all of whom were, at that point, significantly motivated to demonstrate institutional accountability before institutional accountability was demonstrated to them. The vote was not close. Minsu received the notification at 4:47 p.m. He read it, set the phone down, and looked out at the city. Then he picked up the gold star thread. It's done. The board has removed Junio's administrative access. By tomorrow morning, the conduct investigation against you will be formally closed and your scholarship reinstated. Your housing notice will be rescinded tonight. He watched the 3 dots appear. Disappear. Appear again. How? She finally sent. Carefully, he wrote back. And a long time coming. A pause. Then, is he going to come after me again? Minsu looked at the criminal referral confirmation on his desk. At Terence Polk's cooperation agreement. At the journalist's article, which Coretta Webb had told his attorney would run in the morning edition. No, he typed. But he doesn't know that yet. Han Junio came to her dormitory at 7 p.m. She heard the knock and thought it was Priya, and she opened the door without checking, which she would later identify as the last moment of genuine carelessness she ever permitted herself. He was shorter than she'd imagined. She had built him up in her mind into something enormous, a man of huge, deliberate cruelty, and the reality was a man in his mid-50s in a good overcoat, silver-haired, with a particular bearing of someone who had spent decades being agreed with. He looked at her the way people looked at problems they had not yet decided were serious. Miss O'Say. His voice was moderate. Boardroom smooth. May I come in? No, she said. Something shifted in his face. Just slightly. I think we should speak. There are aspects of your situation that. I said no. She kept her hand on the door frame and her feet square and her chin at the angle, and she looked at him with the wide, expressive eyes that were her mother's eyes and did not move. He stepped closer anyway. Not enough to touch her, not that, not yet, but enough to use his size, his age, his suit, his decades of institutional authority as a wall between her and the rest of the hallway. You're a smart girl, he said, dropping the boardroom voice to something quieter, more direct. Smart girls understand when a situation has run its course. The documents can be re-examined. The conduct investigation can go in several directions depending on. Her phone rang. She already had it in her hand, she had picked it up the moment she'd seen his face, some animal instinct moving faster than thought. She looked at the screen. Gold star. She answered it and held it up without saying a word. Just held it where the speaker faced outward, between her and Junio, like something she was offering him to look at. Mr. Han. Minsu's voice came through the phone with the quality of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. Quiet. Absolute. The voice of a man who did not need volume because he had never once in his life needed anyone to question whether he meant what he said. The Attorney General's office received a formal referral this morning. Terence Polk entered a cooperation agreement at 12:14 p.m. The board vote was 4-1 at 4:47 p.m. Coretta Webb's article runs in the morning edition. A pause. You came to her dormitory anyway. Junio had gone very still. The boardroom smoothness had drained out of his face the way color drained out of a thing that was dying. His eyes moved from the phone to Bianca and back to the phone, and in them she could see the exact moment that the architecture of 14 years of careful, institutional cruelty understood that it had nothing left to stand on. I'd suggest, Minsu continued, in the same quiet voice, that you use the time you have left this evening to call your attorney rather than to stand in a 21-year-old girl's doorway. Because if you are still in this building in the next 4 minutes, the next call I make will not be to an attorney. Silence. Junio took one step back. Then another. He looked at Bianca one more time, not with authority now, not with the casual contempt of a man who had spent decades deciding who mattered, but with something that was almost, in its smallness, recognition. Like he was seeing, for the first time, not a problem to be managed but a person who had refused, at every single point, to disappear. Then he turned and walked down the hallway, and the elevator doors closed behind him, and Bianca let out the breath she had been holding since she opened the door. She leaned against the door frame. Her legs were not entirely steady. "Bianca!" Minsu's voice through the phone was different now. Still quiet, but the particular quiet of something that had put its armor down. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true in a way she hadn't expected, I didn't move. He tried to make me feel small and I didn't move. A pause. "No," he said. "You didn't." She slid down to sit on the floor of the doorway, back against the frame, phone pressed to her ear, and laughed. A short, sharp laugh that was 90% relief and 10% something she didn't have a word for yet. "You were listening the whole time?" "I called the moment I saw his car pull onto campus." "You can see his," she stopped. "You know what, I'm not even going to ask." "Probably wise." She looked down the empty hallway where Han Junio had been standing 30 seconds ago. The overhead lights buzzed their usual flicker. The carpet was the same institutional beige it had always been. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, and nothing was the same at all. "You said you'd explain everything," she said. "Not over text. Not for something this big." She paused. "I think this is big enough now." A long silence. "Yes," he said. "It is." Another pause. "Can I come to the university? Tomorrow?" She looked at the phone. At the gold star next to his contact name. At the 21 years of distance that had lived in the space between a woman who had crossed an ocean and a man who had saved a file he never opened. "Yes," she said. She stood outside the main entrance of Hargrove University at 10 in the morning and told herself she was not nervous, which was the most obvious lie she had told herself in recent memory. The November air was sharp and clean. Campus had the particular quiet of a Wednesday that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Priya had offered to come with her and Bianca had said no. This was not a thing she wanted witnessed, not yet, not until she understood what it was. She had worn her good coat, the charcoal one she saved for presentations, and she had left her hair exactly as it was, natural and full, because her mother had raised her to take up space even when every instinct said to make herself smaller. She saw the car first. Black, long, moving with the unhurried certainty of something that had never once needed to rush. It pulled up to the curb and idled, and for a moment nothing happened, and then the door opened. He was taller than she'd imagined. That was the first thing. Broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had been built by difficulty rather than a gym, dressed in a coat the color of charcoal that made him look like part of the winter morning. The tattoos she could see at his collar and on the back of his hands were intricate and dark and old, the kind of ink that had been earned rather than chosen. He wore an expensive watch and he moved with the stillness of someone for whom the world had long ago arranged itself around rather than the other way around. He saw her immediately. She watched him stop. Not dramatically. Not the way people stopped in movies when they saw something that changed them. He just stilled. The way a person stilled when they recognized something they had been looking for so long that seeing it had become almost impossible to absorb. She understood, in that moment, why. Because she was looking at her own eyes. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Her eyes, exactly, the shape of them, the particular depth of them, the way they held what they were feeling without completely hiding it. She had spent 21 years looking at her reflection and seeing Amina in her mouth and her cheekbones and her hair and wondering where the rest of her had come from. She had asked Aunt Forlake once, and Forlake had gone quiet in the way she went quiet about Amina, the careful quiet of a woman protecting something she'd promised to protect. She understood now what Forlake had been protecting. Minsu walked toward her and she stood her ground, the way she'd stood her ground in the doorway last night, feet square, chin up, and when he stopped 3 feet in front of her she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because some things were too large for the first words to carry. He spoke first. She named you after her grandmother, he said. His voice in person was the same as it was through the phone, quiet, no performance in it. Bianca Amora Osei. She told me the name before. He stopped. Steadied. Before everything. Bianca's throat was very tight. You knew her? Yes. You knew her and she left, and She left to protect you. His voice didn't waver, but something moved in his face, something old and enormous and carefully maintained for a very long time. She looked at my world and she made the only decision that made sense to her. I didn't know about you. She didn't tell me. I found the file she'd left, a letter, weeks after she was already gone, and by then, he paused. By then she'd made herself impossible to find. Because she was very good at protecting the things she loved. The things she loved. Bianca looked at him, at her own eyes in a stranger's face, at the tattoos and the expensive coat and the terrifying, quiet steadiness of a man who had spent 22 years carrying a folder he couldn't open, and felt something in her chest shift. Not break. Not collapse. Shift, the way tectonic things shifted, the way the ground moved when something that had been building pressure for a long time finally found its release. She saved your number under a gold star, Bianca said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. I know. She kept it for 22 years. I know. She didn't tell me about you, but she kept it. She looked down at the phone in her hands. At the gold star in the contact list. She knew. Someday. She knew I might need it, he finished. Yes. She looked back up at him. She had 1,000 questions. She had the shape of a grief she hadn't known she was carrying because you couldn't grieve the absence of something you didn't know was missing. She had the weight of 21 years of a story that had been deliberately incomplete, and the knowledge that the incompleteness had been an act of love rather than abandonment, and she wasn't entirely sure yet how to hold all of that at once. But she was Amina's daughter. She had been built for the holding of heavy things. She made red lentil soup on Sunday mornings, Bianca said. She left a bowl for you. Minsu went very still. Aunt Folake told me once. She said Amina always made 2 bowls on Sundays. One for herself and one for, she paused. She never said who. I always thought it was a habit from home, from Lagos, from keeping a place at the table. It was for me, he said. I know. A long silence. The campus moved around them, students crossing the quad, a professor with a coffee cup, a maintenance truck grinding along the service road, and in the middle of all of it, on the front steps of a university that had tried to erase her, Bianca Osei looked at her father for the first time. She didn't call him that. Not yet. Some words needed room to grow before you could say them. But she took one step forward, and he stayed exactly where he was, and she looked at him with her mother's stubborn, open, refusing to be diminished eyes and said, You said you'd explain everything. I will. All of it. As much time as it takes. And Han Junio. Something moved in his expression. Something final. Handled. And my mother. What happened to her? I want the whole truth. You'll have it. All of it. He paused. You deserve all of it. She nodded. The tight thing in her throat had not gone away, but it had changed quality, less like a closing and more like a door. She looked at this man who was her father and who had sent a tactical team to a warehouse at midnight and who had sat on a text thread through the longest night of her life and who had dismantled a corrupt man's 14-year empire to clear her name and who had kept a file he never opened because opening it was too close to saying goodbye. Okay, she said. For the 3rd time. Her word for trust. His expression did the thing it had been doing, that shift, that enormous, carefully contained thing. And this time he let it. Okay, he said back. They stood there on the steps of Hargrove University in the cold November air, and for the first time in 21 years, neither of them was standing alone. She walked across the stage on a Thursday in May. The auditorium was full. It was always full for Hargrove graduation. The university had a tradition of production, of transforming the main hall into something that felt significant, that felt like the kind of ceremony that made all the preceding years feel purposeful. The faculty sat in full academic regalia. The families crowded the balconies. The graduating class moved in alphabetical order, slow and deliberate, and when the dean read each name it carried in that particular way that names carried when said in large rooms, when they were being handed their full weight for the first time. Bianca had not slept well the night before, which was not nerves exactly but the particular wakefulness of someone on the edge of a thing they had been working toward for so long that the arrival felt unreal. She had video-called Aunt Lake at midnight and Lake had talked for 45 minutes about Amina, really talked, without the careful quiet, without the protective silences, and it had been the conversation Bianca had needed for 21 years, the one that had finally been possible now that the thing Lake had been protecting was no longer a secret that needed keeping. She had called Minsu after. "Can't sleep," she'd typed, because calling still felt different than texting, more formal somehow, which she recognized as irrational given everything, but there it was. Neither, he'd written back immediately, which meant he'd been awake too. "Are you coming tomorrow?" A pause. "Do you want me to?" She had thought about that for a moment. About the 6 months of twice-weekly dinners at a restaurant near campus where they had worked methodically through the explanation, all of it, the whole truth, the warehouse and the file and the hospital records and Amina's whistleblower complaint and what Ryan had found buried in the clinical language of 2003. She had cried twice during those dinners. He had not cried, but there had been one moment, when she'd shown him a photograph Aunt Lake had sent, Amina laughing in the orange apron, where he had been quiet for so long that she'd stopped talking and just sat with him, because that was the thing about grief, that you couldn't always talk your way through it. Sometimes you just sat with someone until they were ready to come back. She had thought about the conversations after dinner, walking back across campus, him matching her pace and listening in the way that he listened, completely, without preparing his next sentence. She had thought about the Sunday 3 months ago when she had finally gotten the soup right, the real version, the Amina version, and had brought a container of it to the restaurant and watched him eat it in silence with an expression that she'd now catalogued as his equivalent of coming undone. She had thought about the word she still hadn't said. The one that needed room. She was starting to think the room was ready. "Yes," she had typed. "I want you to. Then I'll be there." He was not in the family section of the balcony. She had looked when she filed in with her row and hadn't found him there, which had produced a moment of something she quickly managed, and then she had looked to the wings, the curtained area at the side of the stage that was technically reserved for faculty and administration, and she had found him standing in the shadow of the curtain in a dark suit with no tie, watching the stage with the focused stillness of a man who had arrived early enough to find the position with the clearest sight line. She had smiled at the curtain from across the room. The smile he sent back was small and not quite practiced, which she had learned was how his real ones looked, unpracticed, like something that hadn't been used enough to get smooth. "Bianca Amora Ose." The dean's voice carried her name across the auditorium and she was already moving, chin up, shoulders back, the charcoal coat traded for the black gown and the gold honor cord that hadn't been a certainty 6 months ago and was now hers completely. She walked across the stage in the way her mother had apparently walked into every room, like she had already decided she was going to win, and when she took the diploma from the dean's hands she felt the weight of it as something more than paper and binding. She felt it as a rival. The applause was general and warm, the way graduation applause was, and she smiled at the audience and found Aunt Lake in the 3rd row of the balcony. Lake, who had come from Chicago, who had cried through the entire ceremony and was crying now with no apparent intention of stopping, who had loved her in the steady, armsful way and would now, Bianca thought, be able to love her with both hands free. She looked to the wings. Minsu was watching her with that expression she'd catalogued, the enormous, carefully contained thing, but less contained now than it had ever been. He was not a man built for auditoriums and ceremonies and the public performance of feeling. He was a man built for 43 floors above the city and tactical decisions and silence that meant something. But he was here, in the wings of a university graduation, watching his daughter walk across a stage, and the expression on his face was the most honest thing she had ever seen on a person. She gave him the smallest nod. He gave it back. She kept walking, descended the stairs on the other side of the stage, and returned to her seat holding a diploma that bore her full name and the words Merit Scholar, Permanent Award on the inside cover, the permanent scholarship that had been formalized 3 months ago, after Junio's removal from the board, after the new administration had reviewed her original application and found it exactly what she had always said it was. Clean. The ceremony continued around her, more names, more applause, the dean's closing remarks about futures and responsibilities and the world that waited outside, and she sat with her diploma in her lap and thought about her mother. About Amina at 23 crossing an ocean with 2 suitcases and an absolute refusal to be diminished. About the red lentil soup and the Sunday mornings and the gold star saved in a phone for 22 years like a door left slightly open, just in case. About the whistleblower complaint and the hospital records and the quiet, devastating bravery of a woman who had decided that the best protection she could give her daughter was the protection of not being known. About how Amina had not been able to outrun what came for her. About how her daughter had. The recessional music began. The graduating class rose together. Bianca stood with them, diploma in hand, honor cord gold against black, and she let herself feel the full size of what this was, not just a degree, not just a scholarship restored, not just a corrupt man's empire dismantled and his victims' records corrected. All of that. And also, a girl who had spent 21 years making herself invisible finally taking up the exact right amount of space. She filed out into the lobby with her row. Folake found her in 45 seconds, moving through the crowd with the focused efficiency of a woman on a mission, and pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to be a whole conversation. "Your mother," Folake said into her hair, and couldn't finish it, and didn't need to. "I know," Bianca said. "I know." When Folake finally stepped back, wiping her eyes with the absolute absence of embarrassment, Bianca looked over her aunt's shoulder. Minsu was standing at the edge of the lobby. He had moved from the wings sometime during the recessional, and he was waiting at the margin of the crowd with the patience of a man who had learned how to wait, not passively, but with the full-bodied intention of someone who was done with distance and willing to stand at the edge of things until he was invited in. Folake followed her gaze. Something moved in Folake's face, recognition, and then something older, something that had been waiting alongside Bianca's questions for 22 years. "Go," Folake said softly. Bianca crossed the lobby. She stopped in front of him and he looked at her, at the diploma, at the honor cord, at her mother's face looking back at him with her own eyes, and she thought about the word that had been needing room, the one she'd been circling for 6 months, and decided that the room was ready. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what to call you." He was very still. "I know it's not simple," she said. "I know it takes time. I know we have things we're still working through." She looked down at the diploma in her hands and then back up at him. "But I think—" "You don't have to," he said quietly. "Not until you're ready." "I am ready," she said. "I've been ready since you came to campus in November and I looked at your face and saw where my eyes came from." She took a breath. "I just needed to stand here first. Like this. With this." She held up the diploma slightly. "So I could meet you as myself. The whole self. Not the girl in the warehouse, not the girl with the suspended scholarship, not the girl who was scared." She paused. "Just me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Just you," he repeated. "Just me," she confirmed. "Hi." Something broke open in his expression, the contained thing, finally, fully, and it looked like relief and grief and 22 years of a folder kept in a safe, and it looked like a man who had been given something back that he'd thought was unrecoverable. "Hi," he said. She held out her hand. He took it. Not a handshake, nothing that formal. Just her hand in his, her slim fingers against his tattooed ones, and the lobby noise of 100 graduating students and their families moving around them like water around 2 fixed points. "Dad," she said. Trying it. Letting it have its full sound. His hand tightened on hers. It fit the way things fit when they had always been meant to fit, when the distance between them had been geography and circumstance and a mother's love fierce enough to burn itself away trying to keep a child safe, and not a verdict on what was possible. Outside the university's tall windows, the city moved and blazed and hummed with its enormous, indifferent energy. 43 floors above it, an office sat temporarily empty, the view from its window showing the university steps below. Down here, in the lobby, Bianca Amora Ose stood with her diploma and her honor cord and her mother's stubborn, open eyes and her father's hand in hers, and she was not hiding. She was not invisible. She was not the girl in the warehouse, knees pulled to her chest, waiting to be found. She had been found. More than that, she had found herself. And that, she thought, was the thing no one could suspend, and no one could fabricate evidence against, and no one could take from her regardless of how long they had spent trying. She was her mother's daughter. She was here. And she was exactly enough. She was her mother's daughter. She was here. And she was exactly enough. If this story found you today, if Bianca's fight felt familiar, if Amina's love hit somewhere deep, if Minsu's quiet loyalty made you believe that the right people show up at the right time, then you already know this story was never just fiction. It was for every person who ever had to hold their head high when the world was actively trying to bring it down. It was for every quiet girl who was told her silence was weakness, when really it was a storm learning its own name. It was for every mother who loved so fiercely she made herself invisible to keep her child safe. And it was for every person still waiting for the door to open, the one that was left unlocked for them a long time ago, by someone who never stopped believing they would find it. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. New chapters drop regularly, and the next one? You are not ready. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, your city, your country, your corner of the world. I read every single one. I want to say hello to you personally, because this story only travels as far as the people who carry it, and you carried it all the way to the end. If this moved you, share it with one person who needs to hear it today. You never know whose warehouse moment this might reach. You never know whose wrong number text this might answer. Like, subscribe, comment, and come back.